So if you're like me, when you woke up the other day, you went, maybe you flipped on the switch next to your bed on your light or your lamp, or maybe you walked out of the room into the bathroom and looked to see if there were any lights on in the house or in the neighborhood. Maybe you checked first your coffee brewer or something like that, or your electric toothbrush. Maybe you checked your phone to see if you still had cell service or whatever it was. But it appears that most of us here, at least, we were on the grid. We were still on the grid. I don't know if any of you lost power. We didn't lose any power. There were some power outages scattered in our area, but I know that a lot of people did lose power, and certainly down south, there are still people who will be without power. They'll be off the grid completely for months, it seems. And that's really distressing. And that shows us just how dependent we are on our national electric grid and how fragile it is. And we can complain all we want about all sorts of things about the way it's delivered to us and that grid. You know, personally, I think it's time to really hope this infrastructure bill that they're working on will somehow manage to get a lot of the electrical lines and telephone lines, whatever they are, underground, where they're at least a bit safer than they are above ground, like many places in Europe. But even that's not 100%, right? We don't know, but it's a little better. And I have to confess, I have really no idea how electricity works. To this day, I don't know. I don't know if most of us do know how exactly it works. I just know what it is. It's the stuff that I depend on pretty much 24 hours a day. I know how to use it, and I know that it's a double-edged sword. It wasn't long after we learned how to harness this power and bring it into our homes and our workplaces and our streets. It wasn't long after that we figured out how to turn it into a death machine, to take those people that we think no longer deserve to be among us and kill them. That's really what it is. It's amazing what we can do with gifts that are given to us by the universe, like electricity, how we can pervert them. So just what is, anyway, a power grid or an electrical grid? Well, we've heard a lot about it in recent years because it seems that some on our grid, and frankly, coincidentally, in Texas, it's really fragile. Our grid in the US is in pretty bad shape. We saw that over the past, 20 odd years with Sandy and Katrina, Floyd, when that happened. We saw it just now with Ida. We see it every year in various parts of the nations where there are tornadoes and bad weather, terrible weather. But an electrical grid, it's an interconnected network for delivering electricity from the supplier to the consumer. That's really all it is. It consists of generating stations. And if you've ever driven down the turnpike or in other parts of the country along certain roads, you'll see those generating stations that produce the electrical power and those high voltage transmission lines that carry the power from distant sources to the demand centers or to rural areas. And that connects those customers to the supplier. And those power sources can be located at a fuel source, like a dam site. Think about the Hoover Dam or some of the other, the Cooley Dam. And they take those renewable energy sources, like the flow of water or the force of water, that are often located far away from our populated areas, and they bring it to us. They take that, the force of it and the power of it, and turn it into electricity. There's one of those miracles, right, that we should be grateful for every day. It's really an engineering marvel, but our aging infrastructure requires some changes. A number of years ago, we had the Recovery Act, and there was about $4.5 billion invested in modernizing the grid. to enhance its reliability. And to some extent, it's done that, but a lot more needs to be done. So what's the distinction, though, between grid reliability and grid resiliency? A more reliable grid, I've read, is one that has fewer and shorter power interruptions. So some of us have experienced this on occasion where the power goes out and we're thinking, oh no, break out the candles, break out the flashlights. It's going to be a long night or whatever. And 5 minutes later, the power comes on, or it comes on and off and on again or off again. Sometimes we have power loss for a couple of days. We had that a couple of years ago. I remember Lisa and I were still living in Upper Saddle River, and we had our generator working in order to keep our refrigerator and some lights going in the house. A more resilient grid, though, is one that's better prepared to recover from those adverse events like we had this past week, like the storm down in the south, or that came up here, Hurricane Ida. And severe weather is the #1 cause of power outages in the United States, and it costs us between $18 and $33 billion every year in lost output, in wages. People can't work in the dark, or we have to pay those linemen extra hours to get those things back up and running. Spoiled inventory. Think about all the restaurants and all the food stores and all the supermarkets and all those places where the inventory gets spoiled because there's no electricity. If they're fortunate, they have generators. All sorts of things. And the number of outages caused by severe weather, though, is expected to change now and increase. And we can see that that's happening because of climate change. We see what happened around here. When was the last time we saw historic flooding like this? I don't remember it in our immediate area like I saw in my lifetime. Not as bad as it was this time. When you see the New York City subways flooding the way they flooded, you know that things are getting worse. And so we have to invest. Our nation has to invest in a better solution for the 21st century as we move forward, and strengthen the resiliency and the reliability of that grid. But as important as the electrical power grid is to the infrastructure in the United States, there's another power grid that I think that's just as important, more important perhaps, and that's our spiritual power grid. The grid that keeps us functioning in our daily lives, in our daily spiritual lives. And there are some parallels to the electrical grid, right, that we can make when we talk about the spiritual power grid. 4 of those are interconnectedness, reliability, resiliency, and a source of power. And I've spoken about interconnectedness a lot of times in the past, and I do that because, like you, I believe that it's vital. It's vital to our spiritual lives, to our emotional lives, even to our physical well-being. And in all my years of spiritual exploring, I've yet to find a serious practice that didn't acknowledge the importance of being interconnected with other people. I remember years ago, many years ago, there was a point in my life where I was just at wit's end. Spiritually, I was just dry. And I wanted nothing to do with being part of a congregation, being part of any kind of spiritual practice. And for me, that was really weird, but I didn't go. I wouldn't go. And I had a friend who was a minister, a Lutheran minister in the town we lived in. And I bumped into him one day and he asked me how I was doing. He knew me from the interfaith group in town that I had been part of. And I said, yeah, I'm not really involved anymore. And this was a guy who was usually pretty jovial and laughing a lot and all this stuff. And he looked at me with a really serious look on his face that I'd never saw. And he said, Paul, he said, you know, I love you and I would never ask you to come to my church. He said, but you need to be somewhere. You need to be connected with others. And he was right. He was right. And eventually that happened. Not to be connected is to invite, frankly, spiritual death, if you will, possibly, you know. After a while, it's harder and harder to make the connection. And there are some spiritual practices, I think, any philosophy or any spiritual practice that doesn't stress interconnectedness is likely to remain rather small and not very influential, or to eventually die out. There are those groups that separate themselves from others and they generally don't last, or they remain very small. And there are those philosophies that don't acknowledge the importance of interconnectedness. In fact, some of them deny it. Think about the philosophy of Ayn Rand, if you've ever read any of her books. Her philosophy of objectivism, which is really nothing more than extreme selfishness. Concern for oneself only. Don't worry about your family. Don't worry about others. In fact, most of them say they don't like kids. They don't want to. You know, it's really a very selfish philosophy. And we've all, I don't know how many of you have read any of her books. I had no idea what she was talking about or who Ayn Rand was when I first read her book, Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead. And I really didn't quite get the books. All I knew is I didn't like many of the characters in those books because they were selfish human beings. But that's her philosophy, or was her philosophy. Interconnectedness is the polar opposite of objectivism. One of the, if you've ever seen old movies or if you've seen old postcards or whatever, you know that, or read history books, you know that in the early part of the 20th century and in the mid 19th centuries, you know, parlor games were all the rage. You know, you had all these parlor games. People would do seances and they would do the Ouija board and all those things. But one of the fun things that they used to do when electricity was first being harnessed is they used to hold hands in a circle in the room while someone else held a low voltage electrode that was connected to an incandescent bulb. And if somebody let go of somebody else's hand, the bulb went out because the connection had been lost. I don't know who got the brilliant idea of connecting themselves and holding anything electric and joining with others to do it. Not something I would do, but that was a parlor game back then. That's how interconnectedness works spiritually, though. We're simply stronger and we're more powerful when we're connected to others instead of going it alone. So just how connected are you? How connected am I to other people? When do we feel, or how do we feel when our energy is being sapped or it's waning? And what do we do? What do you do when others look like they need a boost? Do you hold on to your store of spiritual energy or do you share it? The reality is that sharing our spiritual energy renews not only the person we're sharing with, but it renews us as well. That's one of those paradoxes of spirituality. The more we give, the more we have. You know, Jesus alluded to that when he talked about, if you know the parable of the widow's mite. They call it, a mite was a piece of coinage back then, and it's all she had. It was the smallest amount of money that you could carry in coin, and that's all she had. And she came to the temple to pray, and she dropped her she was a widow. She dropped her last piece of money into the offering box, while rich men would come by and who could afford a lot more and just drop a little in. She gave every last thing she had so that she could remain connected and help others remain connected spiritually, so that the work of the temple could continue. Interconnectedness also applies to the wider world as well. Our spiritual strength has an effect on those in our communities as well. We know that because we help other organizations, some of the organizations I mentioned, like I mentioned before, or organizations that we donate to, whether it's outside of UUCP, apart from UUCP, as important as that is. And by the way, I'll make the announcement now, the offering button is in the order of service. But when we help others, maybe others we don't know, our community benefits. So on those occasions, maybe during a year when you donate to the food pantry, or you give a donation to a local charity, you're helping your community. And then the next thing is reliability. We need to be certain that our connection is a reliable one, right? We all know what happens when the power grid goes down. It can be really annoying. It can even create havoc, like we've seen. And that's why the grid needs to be maintained, so it's reliable. When I was in India, I can't tell you how many times at night there were what they call brownouts. They would have rolling brownouts to preserve electricity, or the electrical grid would just shut down. And people there learned to live with that. They're not happy about it, but they learned to live with it. And they've devised interesting ways to get through those times when the power goes down. I've told that story before, and I'll tell it quickly again here because I'm getting old and I get to repeat myself. So there's the story when I was in India. I was at a temple and I was there for the evening puja. And it was a gigantic temple, big temple. And I walked outside into the courtyard, the complex. And as I'm walking around, all of the lights went out, all of the lights around the temple. And it was utter darkness. And I was a little nervous. I was scared. I thought, well, maybe they'll come back on in a few minutes. But as I looked up, I was amazed because there were no lights. So there was nothing no ambient lighting. And all I could see were stars. More stars than I had seen. Even with all the pollution in India, I could see millions and millions of stars. And I was just fascinated by it. And all of a sudden, I jumped because somebody grabbed my elbow. And this young Brahmin priest looked at me and said, "Come on, I'll bring you back inside." He said, "Sometimes God turns out the lights, so we remember to look up." And I went and he brought me inside. And then later that night, even he brought me home to his house and I had dinner with his family. That's a reliable connection. Perhaps you found one here at UCP. I hope you have. It's a very reliable spiritual connection here. Each person here sharing spiritual connection with others, increasing the ability of everyone to stay charged on a daily basis. But that requires reliability on our part individually too. And so we talk about resiliency. Resilience simply means the ability to spring back. We often speak of people as being resilient. We talk that way a lot of times about children who are going through divorce. I don't know that I agree with it completely, having been through a divorce and having had children. And I know children of divorce apart from my own. Many of them are resilient. Not always, but we speak of it sometimes glibly, but it really is an important thing. How resilient are you? Sometimes what we see as resiliency in a person is really not resiliency, but an ability to hide their feelings. And that's when we really need to be reliable for someone so that we can let them know that it's okay to show their real feelings, to be honest with their feelings. They don't have to put on a happy face. Just buck up and think about that old Dick Van Dyke song from Bye Bye Birdie. Just put on a happy face, as though that'll make everything right. That's not resiliency. Resiliency is when people can say, yes, I feel this way, but I'm going to move on anyway. And I'll work through this with help from others. Remember how we said that severe weather is the #1 cause of outages in the US? It's the same thing in our spiritual lives. A little rain now and then can be annoying, and it can get us down, and usually we bounce back pretty quickly from that. But we have even extended periods of rain. Past couple of weeks, we had a lot of rain, and then we really had rain. But what about when the severe weather that we had strikes? How resilient are we? And so there are ways that we can maintain our interconnectedness and our reliability and our resiliency, and that's to remain as close to the source as possible. Whatever you call that source, it can be God, the universe, the void. It can be family. It could be just calling it love. Remain close to it. Remain near to it. Read those sacred texts. Read poetry. Read philosophy. Even read a science book. Pick up Darwin's On the Origin of Species. You may have to read it 5 or 6 times, the first 2 pages, like I do every time I read it, but it's thrilling to read those kinds of things. Go online, look at the Hubble telescope, look at the photos from the Hubble telescope. Just get close to a source that makes you, that you're comfortable with. Another way is to meditate or to pray. Some of us do both in a certain way. And then there's time to repair and reconnect. Make sure that everything isn't always all about work or about getting ahead. Take a walk, take a drive, spend time with your family, with your spouse, whatever. And then help others. We know that helping others is really about helping ourselves. Those are some of my thoughts about our spiritual infrastructure. I hope that you'll take time to check yours out this week and maybe make the repairs wherever necessary. And you're not going to need a congressional bill in order to do it. May it be so.
If you enjoyed this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.